Kia ora koutou everyone, we'll get started. Malo. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Te mihi tuatahi ki te mana whenua o tēnei wahi ngati whatua o Ōrākei. He mihi hoki ki a koutou e hui hui mai nei. Te hunga whai i te matauranga mo te oranga o ngā iwi. First, I'd like to acknowledge the mana whenua on the lands that we stand on, Ngāti Whātua o Ōrākei, and I'd also like to acknowledge all of you here for making the choice to come and join us on this last day of DevNet. Thank you. Malo e tau lava Nisambula Vinaka. My name is Christine Nurmanen, and I'm pleased to chair the session titled Decolonising Aid, the Pacific Law Framework and Influencing Change. As we start this session, I want to share that this will be a slightly different interactive session compared to perhaps some of the other workshops that you've attended. We have 4 speakers and we have opportunities here for audience feedback. So I'd like to just acknowledge Laura, who'll be taking some questions online, Keegan, and also Raisera, who's zooming in from Australia. So today's presentation and our panel today, we are members of the Pacific Law Collective, a network of Indigenous Māori and Pacific international development and humanitarian practitioners in Aotearoa, New Zealand and the region. For those of you who are not familiar with the concept of Koloa, that's all right. We will talk about that briefly. But for now, please allow me to introduce our panel. Our first speaker is Danica Waiti. Danica is of Ngāti Piki Ao and Te Rārawa descent. She specialises in international development programming with a focus on research, monitoring and evaluation. She has provided technical advice to projects in the Pacific, Southeast Asia, East Africa and Caribbean regions, working alongside governments and civil society groups. Would you like to say a few words, Danica? Kia ora. Toleafua Alfred is our second speaker. He's of Samoan descent from the villages of Samamata Itai, Savai, and Salimu Whangaloa. Toleafua has served in the Samoan government and within regional and multilateral intergovernment organisations in the Pacific region. Toleafua specialises in development effectiveness policy, monitoring, advocacy and strategic engagement. Toleafua will be speaking to Decolonising Aid, Closing the Principle versus Practice Gap in Development Effectiveness. Toleafua Tulo, would you like to share some words? Malo lava. Raisera McCulloch will be joining us online from Australia. Raisera lives in Bunjalung country in Australia and she is Tuvaluan. She has expertise in philanthropic circles, non-profit and international development and has successfully developed a relationship-based, trust-based model of philanthropy that empowers grassroots groups to receive untethered funding. She is also the founder of Indigenous Giving Circles. Raisera, I'll pass the mic to you. Would you like to share some words, please?
Hello for everybody. I'm coming to you from, as Christine said, Bunjalung country. I would like to pay respects and acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and also acknowledge that these lands are unceded and I'm very, very grateful to be part of this community where I'm calling in from Australia.
Malo Raisera. And lastly, just a bit about myself. My name's Christine, I'm Tongan. I am Dawn Reid's era baby, born here in Ponsonby. My ancestry is from Ahau, Tongatapu, Niua, Lotofoa, Ha'apai, Ohonua, Ewa. My background is educational research. I've served in New Zealand government circles and policy roles, and also in executive and governance roles in the NGO sector here in New Zealand. My interests are in women in leadership, social justice, and the relationship between Pacific and Māori here in Aotearoa. So today I'll be talking about Koloa as a philosophy for informing practice and influencing change. So we'll go to the next slide, and this is the interactive part. So we're going to have a panel discussion here, and this is the question we are answering. We're asking ourselves as practitioners. I'm using the definition of Talanoa from Dr. Steveni Halapo, and he says Talanoa is full disclosure without concealment. So the question here that I'm asking the panel, just to warm things up, is as Indigenous peoples, we bring a wealth of knowledge passed on from our ancestors. We use this to navigate our everyday lives. It guides the way we think, the way we act. We draw strength from it. We honour it. Thinking about this now in our professional settings, in the development space, and in your experience as practitioners, do you feel that your Indigenous knowledge is valued and honoured? Danaka.
On the whole, I would have to say no. Indigenous knowledge is not always recognised as a strength. And I think that there are ingrained ideas about what constitutes knowledge and whose knowledge counts, and that those are actually embedded in racism.
Malo Danaka. Raisera, we're coming to you.
Yeah, the answer to this question is similar to Danaka's. I don't think that Indigenous knowledge is valued or recognised, because I don't think that people have listened enough. The other thing that I wanted to mention was that often I see in philanthropy work and also grant-making processes that there have been an underlying Indigenous framework of knowledge that's sometimes co-opted. I think that what happens is that once people understand how Indigenous knowledge works, then it can have a risk of being commodified. But Indigenous knowledge is something that's embodied and it's held, and we've held together that cultural knowledge within kin systems for millennia. So that's something that needs to be addressed.
Malo, Raisera.
No, I share the same view. I think, it's valued in principle, but not in practice, as the title of my talk will be. And I think, like what Raisera is saying, that it is co-opted, it's commodified to Indigenous knowledge, and we just need to look at references to Talanoa. We just need to look at references to, these international partnerships like the Huvale partnership between Australia and Fiji, or Solosolevaki between the UN and the Pacific. And scratch the surface, when you look at framing the working arrangements, what you find instead of Huvale and Solosolevaki is fiduciary risk, is reporting lines, is M&E frameworks, all of those things that perhaps don't necessarily manifest the Huvale concept or the Solosolevaki concept.
Malo, my response as a practitioner is very similar, but my perspective is Indigenous knowledge and culture, our wisdoms, are not seen as a premium. So if you can't see it, then how can you value it? And often when it is called into practice, it's done in a context where something's gone wrong. And so when something's gone wrong, then you can't really honour the partner or the people that you're talking to. So that was a good practice, everyone. So that's the panel experience. Now we have an opportunity for people to reflect on that question, and maybe we can take one question from the audience before we go to our first speaker.
structural side, because there are people who have actually researched and said to the literature and said that yes, if we are being co-opted, the development of nations are being co-opted into this narrative. But if we knew that it was meant to be like that and we had no say, and it was going to be an outcome that's so different to what we think is development, would we participate? Would you still continue this seeking the answer, or what would you do as Pacific Islander?
You want to take Malo for the question?
I'll have a go at responding to that, Victoria. If we knew, it's well, how do I put it? Before, well, for example, in Samoa's historical, its pursuit of self-determination. Before there were these international instruments of human rights and all of those things, Samoa was already talking about self-determination through the Mau, when New Zealand and Germany occupied Samoa. So even at its essence, even we knew that we didn't need external leadership, direction, but that if there were people that were going to come into our space, that they would then embed themselves in the constructs and the ways of doing that were providing the necessary well-being, development, whatever needs of our people. So I think that in that context, I wouldn't see, and I think that's what we're now trying to do, is to make more visible those indigenous concepts, to flip the value proposition of our indigenous concepts, but also to redefine mutual benefits by drawing on these indigenous concepts, ways of doing and thinking, as opposed to, the example in your presentation, Itia, where this idea of creating a coastal management protection area, and then the drivers of benefit were 6 drivers based on bureaucracy and 3 drivers based on revenue, which pushed to the side everything else, the kinship, the relational between within the village and also its partnering and all of these indigenous, cultural, political, social interaction that had been forged over the years. So I think that's what we're trying to do here. It's to flip the value and then the subsequent benefits to applying these indigenous concepts.
Malo. Sarah, I'm conscious that you haven't heard the question, but I'm mindful of time and we've got our first speaker lined up, so I'll keep you in mind for our second panel question, Sarah Malo. And thank you again for sharing that question from the audience. So I wonder now if I can ask our first speaker, Danica, to expand on your perspective for us. Gabi.
Kia ora, Christine, and welcome everybody again. It's great to be here and to be presenting in person. It's been a long time. I think in order for us to talk about this, we have to think about the colonial history of Aotearoa and acknowledge that the assimilation processes of that time were really about stripping away Māori culture in all its facets, the language, the tikanga, the processes that come along with it, the values, the worldview. And so we had European colonisers travelling throughout the world with this idea that the Western scientific paradigm was the primary source of understanding and of knowledge, but as Indigenous peoples in the Pacific, we already had our ways of doing things that were working really well for us. So the colonisers came and they slowly just started to dismantle all of those great things about us, taking away our land, our rights to resources, punishing us for speaking our language, forcing us into education systems that told us that we were wrong and that in order for us to be civilised, we needed to go on a completely different pathway. We really needed to do away with everything that made us Māori, made us Indigenous. So we fast forward now to today, and all of those aspects of Indigenous knowledge are widely discussed under the banner of Mātauranga Māori. And so let me provide an example of Mātauranga Māori. You've got the UNESCO definition up there, and I'm not saying it's wrong, it's a definition that we can use, okay? But let's talk about real life examples. So recently in Aotearoa, we established a public holiday to celebrate Matariki. Now Matariki is an example of Mātauranga Māori. Our people have been honouring Matariki for years now, for working out our plans for the future, for settling grievances of the past, for planting, for navigating the seas, all of those things, right? And I'm really pleased at how the bulk of the New Zealand public responded to this new way of honouring a new year. And I'm happy that this mātauranga is being shared with people who are not Māori. But it makes me question, well, why did it take so long for this to happen? Yeah. And so the simple answer to that is because of the legacy of colonialism, it still remains. So Mātauranga Māori is not often valued because there still is that underlying belief that Western science, Western ways of doing things is of more value. So there have been positive shifts, and this public holiday is one example of that. But I think there's still scepticism when it comes to Mātauranga Māori, and it's because the racist beliefs that Westerners, non-Māori, non-Indigenous people are superior to Māori actually still exist if we look deep inside our country. And we see this playing out in our health and our education and our justice systems. And it's evident in the disturbing health statistics of my people, in the increased incarceration rates of my people, and in the poor educational outcomes. So, what does this have to do with international development and the aid space? Before I answer this question, how do I go back? Okay. Before I answer this question, I just want to position myself. I am a Māori woman who is very strong in my culture, and I speak my language, and I do not identify as a Kiwi. Okay, so that's just so you know where I'm coming from with the things that I'm saying today. So if you look around our sector today, you'll see that the majority of the people working in our sector are white. They're non-Indigenous, they're Pākehā. I heard a statistic the other day that just 2% of our sector are Māori and Pacific. Thank you, Eliala, for sharing that the other day. And what does this mean? Well, it means a lot of things, but first and foremost, it means that it's a huge task for us, Māori and Pacific practitioners, to advocate for Indigenous knowledge. Okay, it's one of the reasons why our Pacific Koloa collective exists. We need a safe space to talk about our stuff. This is where we find solace in numbers. This is where we find our strength to keep going. For many years, we've rallied for a seat at the table. And by the table, we mean this decision-making table. And we wanted to have an opportunity for our voice to be heard at that table. But that's shifted now. What we're saying now is, please vacate your seat at the table for us, for Indigenous people, for people of colour, for black people, for minority voices to be heard. So I'm going to unpack that a little bit. I want to acknowledge the work of Tina Ngata. If you haven't heard of her, go find her. She's Māori, she's Ngāti Porou. She tweets and blogs, so you'll find she's an online presence. Her recent article on the fallout of the Roe versus Wade overturn was pivotal for me, because I realised why I've never felt comfortable with the word feminism. And it's because it's often about white feminism. That's what we hear, okay? So I've never called myself a feminist. I've appreciated things about it, But I was like, why? What's so wrong with that? Why is that not a term that I'm grabbing? For me, it's kind of like Kiwi. I never identified as a Kiwi. So white feminism is problematic for me as an Indigenous woman because at its core, it's a centering of white women. And this is in direct contrast to intersectionality. So those are the words of Saida Shabazz on the screen there. Intersectional feminism speaks to me more because it considers race, age, class, sexual orientation, gender, ability, language, religion, educational level, like all of these things that make us who we are, all of our experiences that influence the everyday lives that we have. White feminism has also been problematic for me because, as put by Tina Ngata, and she's got some pearls, this woman, I tell you. Colonialism, white feminism, has never recouped what has been taken from Indigenous, black, brown, and migrant sisters through the process of colonisation. I don't see white feminists in the development sector advocating for Indigenous knowledge. I don't see them pushing Indigenous women forward, but I do see behaviour that resembles that of the colonial. This is a term coined by Tina Ngata. I see non-Indigenous women extracting what they can from the rest of us. I see them delighting in the opportunity to sit at the table and forgetting that they do not speak for the rest of us. How can they? They have completely different experiences from Eliala, from Chris, from our tuahine over here. So I come back to my point. It's no longer enough to be given a seat at the table. It's time to vacate your seat at the table. And if your first reaction is to say there are not enough Māori Pacific women in the development sector to do that, then we need to unpack that, and that's a whole other conference session. So if we look at, this is Tamika Malloy, she's a black woman. She's saying the same thing, but from a black woman's point of view. So where do we go from here? This is a huge list that Tina Ngata has put together for those of you that are wondering, what can I do? How can I think differently? Or how can I advocate for some of the things that I might be saying today? Understand the power of women on this land existed well before we were here. So one of the things I've noticed over my years is Pākehā women commenting on the role of Māori women in Māori society and getting it completely wrong, because for us gender equality isn't about the same gender equality that other people have. So when you come and you start commenting on the way we do things on the marae, for example, not cool. Completely different cultural context. So, you know, there's a lot to be learned, but in terms of practices, centering the rights of Indigenous women, understanding how intersectionality affects people, ceding space is a big one, that's what I mean, vacating your seat at the table, and there are examples of organisations that have done that. I personally know of women who are non-Indigenous who have vacated their positions and put other people in those spaces. Join the call for decolonisation and educate yourself. And my last slide, in case you're interested, is just some of the references that I've used today. So thank you for your attention. I'm going to pass the microphone back to Chris.
Okay, thank you, Danica. Solid anchor right there. I appreciate that. I'm going to take a slightly different tack around decolonising aid and provide a more bureaucratic reflection and one that is based on lived experience. So unfortunately, I don't have any academic resources to share or references to share with you. But there's a lot of examples, man. I've got a lot of lived examples around just how we might consider decolonising aid. And throughout the course of this I've been sitting in some of the sessions, and a common message that sort of struck me is how international instruments of development, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the SDGs, and a host, the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, all of those international instruments have somewhat sort of been not as helpful as they perhaps intended to be. I'm going to actually say there are some that are not too bad, and go back to this Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation as a backdrop, and look at those principles of development effectiveness as a way to really rebalance the power dynamic between, and I'm sorry if it oversimplifies the idea, but between donors and recipient countries. And I do that because as a principle, as a set of principles, they speak to rebalancing power in a way that really vacates the seat, as Danica nicely conveyed it, and make available the seat for the likes of, from my lived experience, Pacific communities in the development partnership between donors and recipients. But in practice, again, that's where we sort of hit a brick wall. And so when we look at the principles of effective development cooperation, for example, we talk about ownership and leadership by recipient countries or developing countries. We talk about inclusiveness and transparency. We talk about a focus on development results. And then we talk about mutual accountability. And in all of those things, I think if you line that up against, many of our Pacific countries, it really positions them in a position of power to dictate the terms of engagement, to dictate the priorities, and to identify where resources are best used and most needed. However, the arrangements that then turn those principles into results create situations where we find that Pacific capability, indigenous knowledge, Pacific expertise is at the lower hierarchies of decision making. The application or the inclusion of those priorities, of Pacific priorities in the development partnership, skewed towards a rewording or reframing of ideas and concepts that turn the investment, that turn the resourcing towards donor partners. Right? And then as I mentioned, in the hierarchy of decision making and the hierarchy of implementation, the structural arrangements that are put in place reinforce or position white expatriate partners in positions of leadership. Right? And I want to just draw on an example from a past life. I worked under a donor regional program a number of years ago, and we were brought in because there was recognition of the principle of Pacific-led development. And so it was drawing on the expertise of a range of Pacific professionals, included me, and combined we brought 60, 70 years of Pacific experience and knowledge, both bureaucratic knowledge, systems knowledge, indigenous knowledge. And the working arrangement was such that it was under a particular financing modality by the donor government, and required us to then redirect the way in which this particular organization was engaging with Pacific countries, so that it positioned ideas. I mean, I'm trying not to give away too much information, so it might expose certain individuals and organizations. But really our role was to engage in policy so that this particular priority would be given value in the policy formulation of Pacific countries, and therefore influence budgets, results, investments of other partners as well. But when it became too hard to do that, and because the white expatriate didn't fully understand or comprehend the value of engaging Pacific professionals, but also the time that it takes to build rapport, to build relationship, to convince in a way that those that we were talking to and engaging could see value for them and could see themselves in the development results. When that became too hard for the white expatriate to understand and process and fit within a particular set of reporting lines, reporting requirements, M&E frameworks, time frames of the donor, and also their management fee, it became, there was this, I'm trying to think of the right English word here, this kind of progressive removal of 6 Pacific development leaders from that organization, in a way that this particular organization reverted back to what was comfortable for them, which was reinforcing white expatriates engaged in the development process, which pushed out the Pacific capability and expertise, and they were able to then meet the donor requirements of that program. So, based on that example, I think what I'd like to say is that when we do, is that, what are some of the structural things that we could change? Well, one is that donor governments not refer to their own instruments of development engagement and implementation to carry out their financing commitments. Incorporate into their design, for example, and I know that's easy to say, but it still requires some people to convince donor governments. But those are political conversations, and they're political conversations that have been had. And the evidence that some of the work that I've been involved in around donor reporting, getting donors to report against good practice principles, engaging in peer review processes of aid management systems of countries and the role of donors in supporting those systems, that evidence has been consolidated, it's been provided to Pacific leaders, and they've had those conversations to influence and to change policy and practice of donor governments. The idea of mutual accountability and inclusion, we now know that the development agenda is no longer the realm of governments, and I think this whole week we've seen that. And that there are now structural instruments or structural platforms that enable a broader set of stakeholders to engage at a particular level of conversation with leaders, with policymakers, and we look to the Pacific region, and there are a number of regional platforms within its regional architecture that we could draw from. The other thing is that one of the strongest pieces of evidence we were able to collate around donor financing was, and with respect to MFAT, given that they're currently trying to work out a climate financing approach, there's been strong evidence to confirm that in the Pacific there's a very robust regional architecture of development organizations, of financing organizations and facilities. A lot of brown people know what they're doing in the Pacific, and so there's been very strong evidence and recommendation to political leaders, and they've also conveyed this to donors, that if you are truly genuine and authentic about ensuring Pacific ownership of their development, then channel the resources where Pacific ownership and leadership is at its greatest. And that's in regional organizations like SPC, like Foreign Fisheries Agency, like USP, like the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat. They've got the mechanisms, they've got the facilities, the tools to channel and deliver on these development commitments. I mean, if that's difficult, I think there's opportunity for 2 of our primary donors in the Pacific to still influence, because they're members of all of those organizations. So there's opportunity there to strike a nice balance, at least from the donor's perspective, of how to ensure if there is fiduciary risk, if there is this accountability back to their taxpayers, well, there's also equal accountability to the beneficiaries of development. And if that's channeled through the regional organizations and the Pacific instruments and platforms that are already in existence, then I think we'll find decolonizing aid won't be too hard after all, I think. And I'll end it there. Mahalo, whaftai.
A round of applause, please, for Danaka and Tole Afoa. And Regan, can you put the next panel question up? Raisera will come to you, but for now, we've got panel question number 2. And again, just have a bit of a read and a reflection, and have a think of, you might be the one that asks the question from the floor. But for now, the question reads, what opportunities can you see for Indigenous ways of working to be front and centre in the development sector? Are there any examples, panel, that we can learn from? So I'm going to ask Raisera to share, then Tole Afoa and Danaka, then I will wrap up.
Thanks, Chris. I am just going to co-sign everything that Tole Afoa just said, because my answer really relates to that. I think in any kind of development work, we need to recognise that it needs funding. And whether you're in philanthropy or grant making, or you're an intermediary group, this really needs to be built on relationships and it not be transactional. So I think that the work needs to be done to ensure that cultural protocols are upheld, whatever that looks like, whether it's being redirecting funding to, like Tole Afoa said, Indigenously led organisations, some more into grassroots work as well, and uphold that. And recognise that power dynamics need to be recognised as well. I think that what we can do is to uphold the Pacific Koloa or the Koloa framework, which I'm going to talk about soon. And really, grant design and delivery needs to be centre of the consultation and the implementation. But the grants need to serve those people that we need to actually make sure that that process is working. Look, Indigenous-led initiatives require flexible funding, and I think we probably need to recognise that. So how are our processes reflecting that as well?
Just on that question, I mean, my only response to that is, Indigenous knowledge manifests through Indigenous people, and I think. I'm not sure how else to explain it. I mean, I think that speaks volumes. And I just want to go back to the point I made earlier about ownership and, the use of, I refer to regional organizations, but it's also Pacific government and country systems as well, using those systems. I mean, they've invested so much reform around how to make sure that they've got sufficient systems to manage a multitude of requirements that they are burdened with by donors. And that's one of the main indicators of good practice is the use of country systems in the international set of principles. But I think there was a recent OECD DAC report that came out just earlier this year on the use of country systems, and my recollection, I could be wrong, but it was around this figure. Only 30% of donor money was being channeled through country systems, which means the remaining 70% of donor money was going through other mechanisms, either created by donors or aligned with or connected with donors. So again, they are Indigenous knowledge that manifests in countries' systems at a bureaucratic level, but also in terms of the knowledge that we find across countries and regional, and in particular Pacific systems.
Yeah, I mean, this whole push for localisation, which is kind of what you're referring to, hey, Tole Afoa, it does represent a space where things can be done differently. In the broader sense, localisation should mean doing things in local ways. But we're not nailing it yet. I still see donor governments expecting their systems to be used, their processes to be in place. So you can't help but question the integrity of that push from some of these players.
Of the two questions to the panel, this is my favourite one. It's framed in a way that it asks about opportunities, but I see it as there's a question here about responsibility. What responsibility do we have to see Indigenous ways of working to be centralised? And if we think of where our feet are, where our boots and sandals are right now, we are in Aotearoa. So isn't that wonderful that we can actually start with Māori? And that becomes the blueprint. Is it ethical that we continue to talk about partnerships for localization in other countries when we're not looking in our backyard and checking and checking and checking again? Have we got it right? We may have done well, but have we done well enough? So this question is framed as an opportunity, but I do see it as a Pacific person that there's a responsibility here. I'm just upping the game a bit because we're here in Aotearoa. And also, we can be the lead for this in our region and be a world leader and speak to this with great integrity and also with great mana, that we've done the heavy lifting to look at ourselves and biculturalism. And so I think, yeah, my favourite question out of the two panel questions is this one. But at this time, we have an opportunity from the floor to ask a question about opportunities to centralise Indigenous ways of knowing. So any takers? Oh, Nina.
I'm just going to ask for your views, I suppose, in the New Zealand context of New Zealand organisations. What do you think about the creation of specific roles related to Pacific peoples or Māori in organisations and governments, in our government departments?
There's when it comes to advocating Pacific ways of thinking and doing, we often refer to amplifying the voice of Pacific. I'll add to that. I think we also need to elevate that voice. So that question you ask about what do I think about Pacific positions? Well, I think the question really for me is where are they situated in the hierarchy of power and decision making? I think there's sufficient amplification of the Pacific voice when it comes to development in Aotearoa's context. We have a Ministry for Pacific Peoples. We have several. We have a Vice Chancellor now in the New Zealand University. We have a few permanent secretaries in the government sector. But that's just two or three. And I think it's a question of, if we're looking at positioning, then it's about elevating the Pacific voice within Aotearoa in a way to influence change, I guess, or systems change. Yeah.
I always feel for the people that hold those positions, because you're bearing a lot of responsibility. And so it comes back to the leadership. So nothing worse than being the only Māori person in an organisation and everyone having their own expectations of what kind of Māori you are, what strengths you bring to the table, what your abilities are, and it's hard when you're that person. So absolutely acknowledge that is one way of approaching getting people's voices at the table, but also acknowledging that there must be other drivers around that, there must be other support, there must be clear direction from leadership of what is expected of those people. And as Toleafua said, it's making sure that they're at the level where it's not just seen as a token position. Oh, Raisera, kia ora. Do you have something to say about that, or?
No, I totally agree. I think that it reminds me of how important PKC has been for us, because there are many times and opportunities in organisations where you're right, Tanaka, the pressure is on us to be able to bring some kind of momentum and change that isn't possible, because you're also right, Toleafua, we don't have those decision-making powers. So there are things to consider.
Sorry, I just need to make one last comment, because it does speak to Danika's point about sharing some sympathy for those people in those positions, because one of the expectations, or the unwritten expectations, from my experience and from others, is that there is an expectation that you will apply your, and this I think is the co-option part, you will apply your Indigenous knowledge and expertise, your relational capital, to effect an institutional mandate. But yet it's not part of the formal performance measures, it's not part of the formal, it's not in your job description. But there's an expectation, there's an unwritten expectation that you apply that wealth of expertise and capability to ensure that the institutional mandate, and I refer to, there's a current project I'm involved in, rheumatic fever among Samoan families. And when someone from the health department goes into a family where the housing conditions are poor, they can't do anything, and they refer to the health department for support. There's nothing there, so they go to, their fellow parishioner who is, the Pacific person in housing, through that informal interaction, and are able then to provide, the housing support, within the health context, if you like. So it's, sorry, that might be a very poorly explained example, but I'm just saying that, there needs to be, as we look at Pacific positions and Māori positions, to also give value and recognition to those cultural and relational capital elements that we bring to the position that's not written in formal instruments.
Malo te lea fo, and given time, I'll just co-sign what everyone's said here and invite Race Sarah to now share your whai kōrero. Malo.
Yes. Thank you, Chris. I was having a think about how we have a feast of things to think about and topics. Today, I wanted to bring to your attention something that had been on my agenda at the intersection, working at the intersection of philanthropy, nonprofit, aid and development. And it really was around the granting process. And so decolonising wealth has been a concept that I've been really working on over here in Australia, but more importantly, around the grant design and delivery that happens within private philanthropy or philanthropy in Australia. We've spoken a little bit about funding. I just wanted to acknowledge that sometimes there's a risk when we're faced with these ideas of being asked to confront history and to pass the mic and to give up the seats at the table, and we can feel a lot of feels about that. But what I'm hoping to do in this very short amount of time, and I might just fly through it, but please feel free to contact me if you want to ask any questions, because there's a few concepts that we're going to weave together. What I'm trying to do now is to quickly introduce to you the Koloa framework and offer the idea that Indigenous wealth needs to be valued, because we are offering an assets-based approach to everything that we do. So I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to run through a few slides with you just to quickly bring to your attention the idea of, sorry, let me do this. There we go. The idea of decolonising wealth. So, and I'll also be using the Pacific Law framework. I'm going to introduce it to you really quickly, and then Christine is also going to talk about it, because we're really excited about the way that we offer this framework to the development sector. I come to you as a practitioner. That's what I wanted to also acknowledge. And when I'm discussing the idea of decolonising wealth, I'm going to be asking some of those hard questions as well. So the next slide has the three core concepts of what we're using in the framework, and it's Koloa, Whakakoloa, and Koloa. And I'm going to go through those with you. I am racing through this. So the question about Koloa is what is wealth? I want to invite you to understand how money and power has worked together historically. Koloa is wealth that we define in the Pacific. It's a word that's used in Tonga, it's Niuean, and it's also Tuvaluan. And it's a holistic approach. So it's inclusive of all social, cultural, political, and economic considerations. as well as the tangible and the intangible wealth. And that's when we consider what wealth looks like, that's what it looks like. When we talk about wealth in a Western context, we're mostly talking about wealth that has been gained through extraction, and really that delivers what capitalism looks like. So these three questions here, if you have pen and paper or you're even interested, we can't go through them today, but these are the questions that we can have a think about individually and with our organizations when we're trying to define what wealth is. And the first is, where is the wealth coming from? So that means we're going to have to face some of those historical truths. Who oversees the distribution, which we've actually discussed a little bit about today, and also what does the data say? With the work that I've been doing, I've been trying to understand more specifically in Australia how funding is being directed to Indigenously led, owned and operated initiatives and organisations, and there's very little data around that. We talk a little bit about the standard of or is there a standard of the work that we're talking about? Is there a way that we're able to actually monitor and evaluate if this work is being done? And so the data is really important for us to be able to understand if we're making any progress in being able to change and shift and introduce and value Indigenous knowledge. So Koloa, the definition of it is really important, and we need to spend some time thinking about that. Solidarity requires an ability to critique everything. And we can't profess to walk alongside communities that had suffered at the hands of colonisation without first reckoning with the history that got us here in the first place. So Whakakoloa is enriching all. And what we do with the framework is we think about it on different levels, but particularly for PKC, we are interested in thought leadership in the sector, which is why we're here, which is why we're offering our ideas, which is why we're offering our challenges, because valuing our lived experience as well is really important. So we believe in enriching all in terms of knowledge and sharing that knowledge. We were talking a little bit about ways of being and how we are able to navigate our jobs and the work that we do. A practical way to look at this with relation to wealth, particularly Whakakoloa, is in the fair distribution of the funding. There's heaps of ways that we can look at the funding principles, which we've already covered, and the reporting, but we should really be shifting to what is a community-centric principle approach to our funding. A lot of the time, which has already been covered, it's very donor-centric in its reporting and accountability. And also in the philanthropy sector, we talk a lot about unrestricted funding, untethered funds that have principles that are around multi-purpose, multi-year funding, which allows Indigenous initiatives and for planning for Indigenous communities. Koloa is our way of being. Like I mentioned, it's an assets-based approach. So we have a lot to offer, and there is a lot of ways of doing things that are not valued. Talia, you spoke about valuing time, and I think that was something that I think is really important. There is always timelines to what needs to be done and considered and completed. And I think in Indigenous ways of being and knowing, time is a really important commodity for us culturally. And so I think that if we are able to value that time, the relationship building, the ways in which there are yarnings or talanoas, or the way that we are collecting data, we're able to then move in a way where we recognize that Pacifica practitioners have a particular way of being that upholds cultural dynamics within our communities, and they need to be valued in terms of the time that it takes to do that. And then the other point that I made was that there needs to be Indigenous-centric decision-making around things. One of the things that I'll talk about quickly before I head over to Chris, because we're going to run out of time, is that one of the ways in which we have been trying to implement this framework is two of our members of the Pacific Koloa Collective have entered into a contract with an INGO, and we are using these principles by embedding the language of the framework into our MOUs and our contracts. We want people to understand that we're working through this framework. We want them to understand that we have a specific definition of wealth and that we are there to enrich all, not just Pacifica, but that our assets-based approach will actually be effective for everybody in the sector. And then it's something that we're trying to really work on within the collective to be able to have people understand that this is the way that we do things and our way of being. And we're hoping that it's going to be effective, particularly when it comes to contractual work and also in grants and funding. And that's me, because I've condensed it a little bit so that we have some time for some questions as well. Chris, thank you.
Can you just put up the final slides? I've just got 4 slides. I'm conscious of time, but if there's any questions, please come let me know. So our origin story, you guys are wondering, who are these guys? So in 2019, when there was the Christchurch mosque attack, and also COVID had been socialised to some degree, I had started my role in Oxfam Aotearoa, or Oxfam New Zealand at the time. And I just want to acknowledge here my former director, Angela Wilton, who I said to Angela, look, where's the people? Where's the Pacific and Māori people? She's like, they're here. You just, go forth and conquer, she says. And so I was tasked to write a report, and Oxfam was looking at scoping relationships with Pacific people in Aotearoa. Parallel to that, I saw the opportunity to talk to our Pacific practitioners and Māori practitioners and just kind of assemble together. Anyway, the scoping report is completed, there are findings, and so the question of, are Pacific people ready to partner with an international NGO like Oxfam Aotearoa? The answer was yes, but we've got to go for Māori first. That was such a clear recommendation from Pacific people here. They said, yes, we have the will to partner, but we will watch you. You will now have to go and tell us how you partner with Māori first and check in with us, okay? And so that was kind of like our spirit that Pacific Koloa Collective came about, 2019. We launched at the SID conference, and since then we've just been sharing our thought leadership, but also creating safe spaces for when we have really tough conversations about our workplace experience. And so, so we meet bi-monthly, and some of us have just met each other for the first time in the last couple of days. So digital, strategies do work. We can assemble, and so as chair, it's such a great privilege to be almost like a midwife, to see our ideas come to life, and also that we challenge the sector. I think it's the mum in us, that we push things through. So that's our origin story, our whakapapa story. So the next slide, please. This is the picture of how the Koloa, whakakoloa, Koloa ia works. It is values-based, and I'm just going to pop over here, values-based. So Koloa is seen and unseen. It is our belief systems. It is our concepts like alofa. Alofa. Alofa is a concept which will materialize in me alofa, which the ambassador said yesterday. That is a process that comes out of the concept of alofa. Alofa. So our values are inseparable from who we are and our ways of being. So the language of Koloa is found in southern and South Polynesia. Niue uses it, Tonga uses it, and Samoa, Ngangana Samoa, but they dropped the K. So it's Oloa. So it is, and what I like about Koloa, it is a verb-based noun. Then when you have the process of whakakoloa, it becomes an adverb. Then we wrap it up to be Koloa ia, to be enriched as adjective. So there's a wholeness in it. So when you live in abundance, where you have Koloa, you are able to whakakoloa, share, practice, and then be Koloa ia, that there was something new that you have created that wasn't there before. And I also reference these Pacific academics who have used Koloa in different ways. Samoan academic, Dr. David Whaavai, who I think is at Waikato University, Samoan Tongan, Dr. Linda Manuatu, who's written articles about Koloa, and Professor Konai Helu Thayman from USB. So these are not new concepts, Koloa. It's been around for centuries. We've just kind of ordered it up. Frame it. As practitioners, we need to be informed by the concept. If you don't get the concept right, you're counting the wrong things. So, next slide. So I've gone ahead and, Keegan, can you? And so I position myself as a Pacific person. I'm not a colonizer, but I am tuakana to Māori Huateina. So my position and how I see the Koloa of Aotearoa plus my Koloa might be different if you're an ex-colonizer or descendant from colonizers. So as tuakana being the elder cousin, being the older sister, your vision and your stretch back to your whakapapa, both back and the next 100 years, slightly different. The concept of tuakana and teina frames your whakakoloa. The concept counts. The concept counts. So if you're tuakana, teina, the relationship and the conversation I'm having with Tanaka might be different to some of the conversations that others will have here, right? So, what kind of conversation does an older cousin have with a younger cousin? The older cousin will say, how can we empower each other? Because we're not partners. We are like furniture. You've been to my house, I've been to your house, you've been to my house. We go back 100 years, but we will bounce 200 forward. We will talk about whakamana. Because whakamana is important to you as it is to me. Because our feet are here together. Your responsibilities as tūranga waiwai will be different to mine, but I see you because I am older. So, when we whakakoloa, when we are enriching, it's process, it's time, it's thinking, but we will create koloa ia. We'll create something that wasn't there before. We're adding value. And so, as tuakana, I'm not the partner. We're not partners. Actually, I'm your protector because I'm the oldest. The oldest will have the first steps to protect the younger sibling. Right? Right. We're not partners. We are tuakana teina. So I will be a bit closer, a bit more mawhana, warm, because I am tuakana, you are teina. So this model, because I'm tuakana, I've looked at Aotearoa, just to give an example, how do we apply koloa, whakakoloa, koloa ia here? And this is a practice that I want you guys to also reflect on, okay? So, tuakana teina, what's the koloa in Aotearoa? Tangata whenua, first koloa, people. How do we whakakoloa, whakamana? It's the te tiriti o Waitangi. That's the policy, that's the resource that we would step into again and again and again. And because I'm tuakana, I don't have to go, okay, the 3 Ps. I'm going to be strategic. Which P am I going to pick? Little cousin, for you to feel that you are sovereign, for you to feel you are in a bicultural community. It won't be partner, it will be protection. Because I will whakamaru you, because I am tuakana. And so the outcome, the new koloa that wasn't there before, because we started with tangata whenua, te tiriti, the last bit is co-governance. Because tuakana understands sovereignty, tuakana understands land, water, rights to that. So the new koloa is co-governance. So I'm also going to have the last slide, Keegan, because I'm going to share here that this is not an academic-only experience, how we tuakana tēnā with our Māori kāinga. So the community is where the change is happening. So this is 2021, and when Māori and Pacific talk to each other, there are some structures we have in place that don't allow the conversation to be flawed. So what do you do as tuakana? You reframe it. So a group have put together a ceremony called Kawa o Aotearoa. Kawa has such a powerful symbol of leadership, and we constructed a new ceremony so Māori are centred in. Highly controversial. When we got it, well, all I thought was, gosh, I'm making so many friends. But it was an act of tuakana. If you can't reconstruct your Koloa, then maybe it was never your Koloa in the first place, right? So here's a picture of Tangata Whenua Rep Peter Ture. He is seated at the top of the cover circle. He's just had his first cover cup. He said it was a bit rough. We're on a vessel on Auckland Wharf. The America's Cup has just finished. We won the cup. And so this ceremony is happening at 6 in the morning because we can't get access to things we like. But we still did it at sunrise. So when you live in abundance, your perspective of the world is different. You have enough. You can be brave and have those conversations. And in this ceremony, it's unique to Aotearoa because we conducted it in Māori. The fact that we could do it in Māori elevates the ceremony even to a level that you feel as a collective. So I share this because when you feel at home and you have all your koloa, you give your best and trust and believe only the best will last. Okay? So it's living in abundance, it's being mindful of the koloa you have, the koloa in this whenua, how you share it and practice it, and what is new. What is the value add when you finish your whakakoloa? So I'm mindful of time. Laura, do we have any questions? No? And that's our presentation. I'll leave it there. If anyone's got any questions, please let us know. But otherwise, ngā mihi nui, mā loa pito, Presera, thank you. And that's us. We've got 5 minutes.
Thank you. I just want to say that was so whakakoloa, because there has been quite a bit of a tension in this kind of conversation, but, in good old ewa fashion or new fashion, you kind of smooth it, it's like our waiata.
Malo.
That was really good. Just a quick question. The terminology and where the context where it will be used, is it the application is just here in Aotearoa, or it's a standard one that can be utilized? Yeah. And if so, then the terminology, I think it's also in connection with other terminologies that are used in research and academia, especially for our own Pacific spaces as well. So like Talanoa. So this one doesn't kind of resonate with me because it's not a terminology that we use from the Western Pacific. So I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
And I think in Papua New Guinea, the idea is to live in abundance. You would have in your Kathy, in your community, terminology that says we live in abundance and these are our values, the highest of our values. And I think this framework allows us to pull that out.
It's just that some of the it's just my point around terminology, because sometimes we use terminology and say that it covers the wider Pacific, which some of us actually don't get it. So it's just a general statement.
Yeah, malo.
Model, but great presentation. Thank you.
All right. I think that's all the questions. Okay.
I really want to ask a question, but I don't want to center the colonizer in the question asking. But
I'm just curious about how the next step beyond that, because, you know, the white people involved in the spaces around you guys are so desperately, you know, terrified of doing the wrong thing and trying so hard to do the right thing and getting it wrong most of the time. But, because what I keep seeing is I think white development practitioners co-opting your traditional spaces and your traditional terms. I'm really uncomfortable with how often I'm seeing Talanoa appear in design documents at the moment, you know, with white designers saying, oh, and our methodology for consultation will be Talanoa. I'm like, how do you know how to do Talanoa? But it's becoming, you know, a way to signal Pacific embeddedness or Pacific knowing, where I think we don't have that claim. But I wonder how you can create a space then around what you're doing, you know, the next layer of the onion, that creates a space for white people who have no cultural background or way of knowing, no way of feeling or understanding any of those processes, to work respectfully with and around you without co-opting any of that work.
Good question. So for Koloa, it's very much values-based. So values-based, identifying what are your values. So my values might be that I have a grandmother who I will spend in a month maybe 85 hours of my time speaking to, and that's important to me. But also putting that back to whoever's in front of me, talking about what their values might be. So often, even at that first step of Koloa, what is your wealth? What is your wealth? Because you're asking about what are the influences of power dynamics that are around you. So the power dynamics around me, the seen and unseen, might be different to what yours might be. And I think Koloa is propositional in asking what matters. Because these are your belief systems, and these are things that are inseparable to your ways of being. So Koloa very much is about values and the things that we can't live without, the things that will be here for centuries. Because some of those practices, when you whakakoloa, are transgenerational, because we're talking about whakakoloa 10, 15, 20 years, 100 years forward, because we already know what's happened in the last 100. So it is that exploratory kind of exercise to identify values, very much. And those concepts, because concepts count.
Yeah, I think there's been 2 points already made on that. First one is Indigenous knowledge manifests through Indigenous people. So I think the second point to enable that is vacate the seat.
Okay.
Oh, excuse me. I just have a comment, really. I'm Sonia. I work for DevNet. And locating myself, I'm a descendant of the North. So I Ngāti Kahu and Ngāti Whakapapa. I do a lot of work with the Pacific, not for the Pacific, with the Pacific. And I just wanted to acknowledge, Chris, your comment about centering the tones of human experience here. I think I've been to, this is my first DevNet. I've listened a lot to colleagues about how they work in the Pacific and this idea of delivering development and making frameworks. It actually exists here, and until we acknowledge that our own colonial history, like my colleague here with her question, but the answers are here. Yeah. We have them in our tuakana relationships when I work for NFAT as a partner government with other partner governments. My thinking is from the perspective, I'm a retainer. New Zealand might have the money, you know, in that power construct, but I'm a little kid going out to people who have hundreds of years more mātauranga than I do. So, you know, it kind of exists for us already. I think we probably, the proverbial, the royal we, we need to be brave in recognising that. Okay. We don't have to continue to look beyond. It's all here, you know. And when I mean here as a locally led solution here, Aotearoa, and here Te Moana Miakiwa. But you kind of got to get your own shit right first, if that makes sense. But I just wanted to acknowledge that. Thank you. You're the first speaker that I've been in a session with that has kind of centred that experience in the wider development kōrero. So kia ora, thank you.
Okay.
Not a question, just a rambling comment.
Thanks, Sonia. Okay. All right. Okay. It's time for us to end. I've noticed that there's a bit of fatigue and you guys have been seated for a while and there's another session coming up. So on behalf of the Pacific Law Collective panel here, to Raisera there in Australia, we thank you, we appreciate your time, your thoughtfulness and also your challenge about what our Koloa Collective our Koloa framework, how it enriches Aotearoa, and also our challenge to you. How are you enriching Aotearoa and transforming and creating something new? So malo lava, ngā mihi nui, and ofato. Thank you. Oh, sorry. We're gonna close in prayer. I'll just say a short prayer for us as we close in our Pacific way. O tua maf ko mauta mai he vania fiona, mau whakamalo atu, he lava mau whakakoloa, mai koloa ia, ke kainga ko tōko ne Aotearoa. A whio he mau ngahi lea lelei, mo loto lelei, ke tau he mau whanonga ki api. Mau kole ngahi mea ko tōko ni a Sisu Christ ko mau whakamooi. Amen. I'll get our stuff. Do you want your stuff?